Stanford University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Hoover Lunch of 2011. We're excited to introduce to you today Keith Hennessey, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and Stanford Law School. He served as director of the National Economic Council and assistant to the president for economic policy for President George W. Bush from November 2007 to January 2009. He writes about American economic policy at keithhennessey.com, one of the Wall Street Journal's 25 best economics blogs. We encourage you to be thinking of questions as Mr. Hennessey is speaking, as we will have a question and answer session at the end.
Excellent. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, everyone, for coming on a beautiful, sunny California day. I've been talking to friends who are back in D.C. and New York today, and they're all swearing at me when I talk to them on the phone. So I've been taunting them a little bit. It's been a lot of fun. I have two things that I think it might make sense for me to talk about. One is the State of the Union address from last night, obviously. And the other is something called the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which is sort of like the 9/11 Commission, but for the financial crisis. And I'm one of 10 members of that commission, and we are reporting tomorrow. And so all of the work that we've been doing over the past year and a half is, in theory, supposed to roll out tomorrow, but in fact, the reporters are all getting a hold of the report today, and so they're all furiously working on their stories. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, and then just throw it open for questions on sort of any topic. Does that sound good? Yes? All right. State of the Union address. Not the most exciting address that I've seen. I think I look at it a little bit differently. Maybe Julie does as well, because we had to have been involved in the process of helping draft or at least fact check these kinds of documents. And so when you've been involved in the process of helping create a State of the Union address, you take a very different approach to it, which is I'm listening very precisely to the exact words that the president is saying. And obviously, we all care about sort of the big picture signals that he's sending and what his message is and what his priorities are. But if you listen really carefully and you know what to listen for, there are all sorts of little hidden policy nuggets. And so I'm actually, if I can find the time, thinking of writing a blog post on things you might have missed about the economic policy statements the president made in the State of the Union address. So I'm going to hit a few of those. I'm going to sort of assume that you watch the speech and then just mention a few little things. One thing is I thought it was kind of interesting stuff that he didn't talk about. We all pay attention to the things that he said, but there are other things that he didn't say. So let me give you an example. The president made a very aggressive statement saying that he was going to send up one of the free trade agreements that the U.S. had negotiated with South Korea. And he wanted Congress to pass it as soon as possible. And that's a very good thing. His administration renegotiated that free trade agreement. I would have been quite comfortable with Congress passing the one that we had a year ago, but it's a good thing that he put that forward. So if you're a free trader, if you like free trade agreements, if you think that South Korea is a strong ally and it's in our economic and national security interest to have this agreement passed, you would say it's great that we have a Democratic president, because of course his party splits on trade issues. It's a good thing we have a Democratic president calling for, the enactment of this free trade agreement. The trick is that there are two other free trade agreements that he didn't mention. And the hard part is that we don't just want one of them, we want all three. And the other two are with Colombia and Panama, two very important allies in Central America. And what makes this hard is that the most likely scenario is that Congress takes up and passes the South Korea Free Trade Agreement, and then the president never sends up Panama and Colombia. So if you believe in free trade, are you happy that the president made the big step on the one that matters a lot economically to the United States? Or are you saying, hey, wait a second here, we don't want to make sure that we just do one and then we leave the two smaller ones by the wayside, which are politically more challenging for him on his side of the aisle. So what I would expect is I'd expect congressional Republicans to start saying, great, we're ready to do South Korea, and you also need to send up Colombia and Panama. Now, the interesting thing about these free trade agreements is South Korea is a big enough economy and there's enough trade between our two countries. A free trade agreement between the U.S. and another country always benefits that other country because we've got the biggest economy in the world. And so it's a good thing for a smaller economy to be able to get the economic advantages of free trade with a country that's as large as the U.S. If it's a really small country, then it helps us economically, but it's kind of like this. South Korea is a big enough economy that the U.S. and South Korea both get significant economic benefits from this free trade agreement. Colombia and Panama are small enough economies that while it moves in the right direction, it's not big enough to kind of really move the needle from an economic standpoint. But there are really important national security and diplomatic reasons why we want to strengthen our ties and our relationships with Colombia and Panama. And part of it is just, frankly, a battle for the heart and soul of Central and South America where there are competing philosophies there. And we want the one that is in favor of freedom and capitalism and free markets to be dominating in that area of the world. And so if there are countries like Colombia and Panama that want to move in that direction, it's in the U.S. interest, in the interest of freedom and capitalism and free markets and democracy to say we want to encourage that. We want to do this free trade agreement. So those free trade agreements are important economically to Colombia and Panama. They're important for many other reasons to the United States. And so while I applaud the president for what he said last night on the South Korea free trade agreement, I'm really concerned that what this may lead to is a dispute in which we say, look, we're not going to agree to move the big one until we know what the disposition is of the other two as well. Try another one. Did anyone notice that the president never said the words climate change, greenhouse gases, global warming, carbon dioxide, cap and trade, carbon tax, carbon pricing, none of those words? That really didn't surprise me because he hasn't used those words in a long time. The interesting thing is he didn't even say green jobs, right? Which has been a mantra for a very long time. And then even more interesting is he didn't even say renewable energy. Does anyone know what phrase he did say? Anyone? He said clean energy. Right? So what's the difference between renewable energy and clean energy? Nuclear is the big one, right? Renewable energy is energy from the sun or the wind or water or plants of some sort, biofuels, right? Nuclear power you usually don't classify it as renewable, but it's certainly clean, at least when you're producing the power, right? There's environmental cost to actually pulling the uranium out of the ground, but you're not actually producing emissions, and you're producing no greenhouse gases when you make the power. So one area that's been significant is that the Democratic Party is traditionally split on nuclear power, where the Democratic Party is generally all for renewable energy, and then the farther left say we're for renewable but not for nuclear. And then when you have more moderate Democrats or Democrats from parts of the country where there is nuclear power and people are comfortable with it, then they say, okay, I'm good with clean energy. So when the president said, I'm for clean energy, that was a signal that he's reaffirming that he's good with nuclear power. But he was continuing something that he had done in the past, which is he's framing all of these issues not in terms of their climate change impact. These are policies which will have benefits in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not the way that he tries to sell them. And so instead what he's talking about is let's mandate that states produce a certain percentage of their energy from renewable, or in this case, clean power sources. Then I went back and actually looked at the speech, and he said clean energy sources, including nuclear, natural gas, and clean coal. Right? So he's now taken the definition of clean power and expanded it into fossil fuel sources. Right? Now, what has he left out? He's left out non-clean coal, right? And clean coal is a technology that you use where you take coal and you purify isn't the right word, but you treat the coal and you treat the emissions so that you're not getting as much pollution, as much greenhouse gas emissions coming from it. So that definition of clean energy excludes coal that is not going through the clean coal process, and it excludes oil used for power. But the U.S. doesn't really use that much oil for power, right? In the U.S., we use coal and we use natural gas and then nuclear is third for the overwhelming majority of our power. So actually on energy, I saw him as making a significant opening toward bipartisanship, because I think that there are a lot of Republicans who will be able to say, look, we don't like the idea of telling states how to produce their power, but if your definition is going to be that broad, we might be able to work something out. Another one, the president talked about corporate income taxes, right, and said our corporate income tax system is really inefficient. We should figure out ways to restructure it. And he said we should figure out ways to restructure it without increasing the deficit. Now, whenever you talk about tax reform, usually what any of your professors around here at school or anywhere will talk about is they always start the discussion by talking about what they call revenue neutral tax reform, right? Which is we're collecting a certain amount of tax revenue into the government through our current code, and that's filled with loopholes and all sorts of inefficiencies and different tax rates for different kinds of things. And what we're going to do is we're going to reform that, and generally what we're going to do is we're going to try and treat all income or all corporate income the same, right? So we'll have a broader tax base and we'll lower the tax rates, and that's better. It's more efficient generally and just better for the economy. But what they do when they say revenue neutral is they're saying, and whatever new system we set up, we're going to set these new rates so that the new system collects the same amount of taxes as the old system would. So we're not using tax reform to try to collect more revenues or less revenues than we did. All we're doing is we're trying to collect the same amount of revenues just in a better way, in a more efficient way. Right? That's where every single policy discussion of tax reform starts, whether you're looking just at corporate income taxes or at a broader range of the tax code. And so everybody heard the president last night, and he said we need to reform our corporate income tax system, make it more efficient without increasing the deficit. And I've read in 3 different newspapers today that the president proposed revenue neutral tax reform. And they all got it wrong. If you say that we're going to do tax reform without increasing the deficit, what does that mean? What that means is that the new system is not going to be allowed to collect less revenue than the old system, right? Because if there are less tax dollars coming in under the new system, then you'll have a higher budget deficit, right? So when he says that tax reform is not going to increase the deficit, he's saying the new system will not be allowed to collect less revenue than the old system. What he didn't say is that the new system will not be allowed to collect more revenue than the old system, right? If he said revenue neutral, he's saying, I want to collect exactly the same amount after as we did before. What he did was he placed a limit on one side, which is, I'm not going to allow this to be a hidden way to cut taxes for the corporate sector generally, but he left open the possibility that he could agree to a tax reform which raised taxes generally. Okay? That's a really important difference, because he might be able to get Republicans to go along with revenue neutral tax reform. I doubt it, but maybe. It's just, actually that's not a partisan thing, it's just hard to get everybody to agree to it. But if his goal is in fact to use this to raise the total amount of taxes on the corporate sector, then there's no way that it's going to happen. Now, maybe it's not coincidental, on the Democratic side of the aisle, if he had said revenue neutral, he would have had a lot of his members in his party who would have said, no, I'm not on board because I only want to do tax reform if we're going to be raising the total amount of taxes on the corporate sector. But the most important thing in the President's State of the Union address from the standpoint of economic policy was the basically afterthought kind of mention that he had of the big entitlements, of the long-term problems, right? The initial part of the speech was basically a list of here are the things that I'm going to spend money on. And a lot of people think that those are good things to spend money on, and then a lot of people think we're already spending too much money, and we fight over whether or not we should be increasing spending on scientific research or education, all those other things. But what we're doing there, and the president actually said, is that we're fighting about 12% of the budget there. right? About 30% of the federal budget is what's called discretionary spending. It's spending that Congress makes decisions on every single year. And that's split. About half of that discretionary spending is national security. It's Pentagon and Homeland Security and fighting the wars and those kinds of things. The other half, 12 to 15%, is what's called non-defense discretionary. And almost everything that you think of when you think of the federal government falls into that second pot. When you think of the FBI and the national parks and border security and health research grants and most of the stuff the Department of Education does, all of those functions that we think of, roads and highways and the FAA and all those things, they're all in that 12 to 15% non-defense discretionary part of the pie. Right? So most of what we think of as the federal government is defense and then all of this other stuff, and those two things add up to about 30% of the total budget. And then over here you have the other 70%, which is called entitlement spending, right? And that is overwhelmingly dominated by three programs. Who knows what they are? Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, right? And when we say entitlements, what we mean is if you meet certain criteria, you are entitled to a benefit, right? So an example of an entitlement program is unemployment insurance. If you've worked for a certain amount of time, right, and then you lose your job and you're out of work, you are entitled to a check from the government for an unemployment insurance benefit as long as you're out there continuing to look for a job. Similarly, if you have worked for at least 10 years in your career and paid Social Security taxes and you are 60-ish, 66-ish or older, right, you are entitled to a Social Security check from the government every single month. Medicare is you're entitled to get health benefits reimbursed by the government every month. Those three programs account for, they're not the full 70%, but they account for the overwhelming majority of that 70%. And the problem is that they're growing at a completely unsustainable rate. So they are the bulk of the federal spending pie, and they're growing much faster than everything else. And so while Republicans and Democrats in Washington are going to beat each other over the head over the next couple of years, fighting about this 12 to 15% of the pie, right? Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, unless we do something about them, are on autopilot, and they're going to be growing 6 or 7% per year, right? And when you look at that as a long-term trend, that's a really, really scary prospect, right? What it means is that our deficits are going to be astronomically high, even 5, 6, 7 years from now, which means either we have to whack those programs then, or we have to raise taxes just up through the roof, or we have to go into these other things and we just have to gut them. And so every serious budget analyst says that our principal fiscal policy challenge is dealing with the unsustainable growth in those big entitlement programs. And the problem is that analytically it's pretty easy at least to say come up with solutions for Social Security, but politically it's very hard. And one of the reasons why it's very hard is that senior citizens all vote and you guys don't. Well, not you guys, but people your age vote much less, a much smaller proportion of young folks vote than senior citizens. And so it's very easy for one party to scare senior citizens into saying, oh my gosh, they're going to destroy Social Security. Even though all of these reforms are actually talking about changes to the benefits that are being promised for people my age, I'm in my early 40s, down to your age. So nobody's actually talking about making changes to your grandparents, but it's very easy for politicians, irresponsible politicians, to demagogue and scare them and get them to vote politicians out of office, or at least to scare the politicians into thinking they're going to be voted out of office. So everybody agrees this is the number one fiscal problem. It is politically very difficult to do. And what a lot of people were really hoping was that the president last night would say, and it's time, we're going to actually see if we can work something out on a bipartisan basis to deal with these entitlement programs. And he basically didn't. He sort of tipped his hat and said, yeah, there's a big problem there. And I'm happy to talk to people about Social Security reform as long as that reform doesn't do this or this or this or this. So he's immediately taking solutions off the table. And he's not putting forward a specific policy proposal. He's not even saying, and I want to have the first meeting next week or next month or anything like that. And so the scary thing is that the most likely scenario is that we spend the next couple years sort of arguing about whether the stimulus was effective and why the unemployment rate is high, while the most serious problem that we have is a medium term, a 3 to 5 to 8 to 10 year problem and it completely probably goes unaddressed over the next couple years, and then we see what happens after the 2012 election. How's that for a depressing way to end talking about the State of the Union address? Let me do 5 minutes on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. How do I do this in 5 minutes? Okay. So there's this really good paper that was put out by two economists at the Brookings Institution, which is interesting because I'm here at Hoover, which has lots of conservatives here, and Brookings has lots of people who are left of center. But I'm actually going to point you to this Brookings paper, which is really good. It's by these two guys, Martin Bailey and Doug Elliott, and they talk about three narratives of the financial crisis. Three different kinds of stories to explain the financial crisis. And the first story is one that points all of the responsibility to the government. And it says basically that government officials made specific mistakes that caused the financial crisis. And in particular, this story tends to point to these two companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which policymakers were using as tools of housing policy. These are companies that were in this gray area where they were private companies, but they were also under the direction of Congress and the executive branch, and so they were being used by policymakers as tools to advance their housing policy goals. And one narrative of the crisis says that the way that Washington policymakers interacted with these two companies, it encouraged lending for houses to people who could never afford those houses, that created a whole bunch of bad loans, and that created the financial crisis. So that's one version of the story. A lot of Republicans are very attracted to that kind of story because it's a story that focuses on the government, too much government, and government that is too interventionist actually having caused the financial crisis. The second narrative of the financial crisis is one that emphasizes individual bad behavior, corruption, and greed. This is the greedy Wall Street bankers brought down the financial system through manipulating both Wall Street and manipulating Washington through their political influence. This is a story that is very popular with people on the far left of the spectrum. There is a third narrative of the crisis. This actually, can we do this like Goldilocks, right? No, too hot, too cold. There's a third narrative. So let me do this one. Then there's a third narrative of the crisis, which is Messier. And it doesn't say that the problem was too much government. It doesn't say that the problem was too little government regulation of the bad actors. Instead of focusing on individuals or just on government, it's sort of an all of the above kind of answer. And in particular, it focuses on economic forces. And it starts with the credit bubble, it starts with the housing bubble, and it's looking at these global economic forces that are then interacting with a financial system that was in some respects broken. And there were clearly things that were broken in the financial system and in the regulatory system. And this part of the story has some of those right. But you can't just say that flaws in the housing system caused the bad mortgages to be there. You need to explain why all of a sudden there was all of this money to be loaned through this broken system. You've got to explain the credit bubble. You've got to explain the housing bubble. And so what you end up with is, and what two of my colleagues and I have written, is we've written a dissent to the report where we lay out 10 causes of the financial crisis, in which we are talking not just about failures and flaws within the U.S. financial system, but talking about some of these global forces as well. I'll be very interested to see how it's received generally, because at least I know in a Washington context, it's easy for me to imagine partisans on both sides being uncomfortable with it. Right? Because the natural instinct of people in Washington is to sort of say the problem was too much government, no, the problem was too little government, and our answer doesn't fit neatly into either one of those boxes, while the other two stories do. So part of what I've been dealing with today is all the reporters are trying to figure out what each of us are going to say in the reports, and they're all trying to get leaked copies of documents, and everybody's getting ready for the big rollout tomorrow, and so that's keeping me very busy. Okay, that was more than 5 minutes, I think. Why don't we, how do we do this now? Just open up for questions? Okay,
Sure.
And we have a microphone even.
Yes, the microphone won't actually like amplify your voice. It's for the online segment of this. So just
Okay.
speak into it, and it won't like amplify your voice.
Okay.
So I'll just pass it up to the front. Whoever's
So
going to ask
here,
first
we got one
question.
there?
Yep. Okay.
And why don't you tell me your name and what year you are?
My name is Otis Reed. I'm a junior.
Okay. And where'd you live freshman year? That's it.
I lived in Trancos and
Okay,
Hoover.
good.
Back when it was 4 class. So my question is, going off the last thing you just said about how this will make people on both sides kind of uncomfortable because it's these global forces, it's not an easy story. I guess my question is, one of the reasons why I think people focus in like too much government or too little government is it's a policy choice, right? It's saying, do we need more government? Do we need less government? So I guess what is your more, should you take something like there was a credit bubble or there was a housing bubble and turn that into a policy
Right. Well, and
question?
so what our dissent, actually none of the 3 stories goes as far as making recommendations. But if you were to take our version of the story and go to recommendations, basically what you have to do is you have to go through each of our 10 factors and say, okay, here's factor number 4, right? And is this one where the solution is more government, less government, or a different kind of government regulation? And in some cases, so for instance, I think that one area where the Fed did mess up is that they allowed sort of a Wild West environment in terms of mortgage lending standards, right? You go in to get a mortgage, and the person who is loaning you the mortgage can give you a document that there's no way in heck you can understand it. There were no standards imposed on the lenders to make sure that the document that they were giving you was factually accurate, yes, but that it was understandable, that it was clear, that a reasonably smart homeowner could figure out what the heck they were committing to when they signed this contract for a few $100,000. So that's an area where I think that there was a failure in which more regulation might have actually helped, and going forward I think it makes sense for there to be more regulation. I think there are other areas where clearly government intervention was causing distortions that was exacerbating the problem, and so you might want to either pull back that regulation, or more likely you probably want to reconfigure it so that you're not causing those problems. And so what it means is you kind of got to go through item by item, which I would argue is, in this case, good policy. It's very difficult to communicate in a soundbite world where everybody just wants the quick 5-second answer. Especially when you have someone over here saying, well, we just need more regulation. You have someone over here saying, well, all we need is less regulation across the board. Who's next? Name, year, and freshman dorm.
I'm Jason. I'm an alum.
Okay.
But freshman year I lived in Laguna Court.
Okay.
I have a question about your view of the Federal Reserve and interest rate policy in terms of this crisis. In my opinion, the Federal Reserve is almost designed to always keep interest rates artificially low to kind of a serial bubble blower. And people don't remember, but after 2000, after the dot-com situation, the Federal Reserve almost tried to create a housing bubble to kind of bail out the dot-com bubble. Kind of like right now it's trying to create a new bubble almost to bail out the housing bubble. And I want to know if you have any view on just interest rate policy of the Federal Reserve over the past 10 years.
Congratulations. You've probably asked the hardest question with respect to the financial crisis. And one of my biggest frustrations with the Commission is that over the 16, 17 months that we worked, the Commission didn't spend enough time dealing with analytic questions like this, and instead spent almost all of its time investigating specific people and specific firms and doing interviews. You got to do both to understand the crisis, but you also got to have a balance. And there are certain economic questions. You've identified one. Another one is, did the bubble in house prices cause the bubble in mortgages? Or did the bubble in mortgages cause the bubble in house prices, or was it sort of a circle? And unfortunately, the Commission just didn't spend enough time talking to smart economists to work through it. So, for instance, one of the leaders in this debate is right upstairs, John Taylor. And he's the principal proponent of the view that Fed interest rate policy was I think he would argue, a primary cause, or certainly a significant cause of the financial crisis. I have a tough time drawing that conclusion because I don't have the expertise that either Professor Taylor has or that Ben Bernanke has. And when you actually try to figure out who's right on the economics, it gets into very detailed, esoteric questions of monetary policy. I think if you start from the assumption that interest rates were too low in this period, as John Taylor does, you can draw a very convincing story that that was a contributing factor to the crisis. My problem is I can't actually start from that assumption because I don't have the expertise. I can't tell you. I know lots of smart people who I respect who think that, but then I know other smart people on the other side who say actually there are very reasonable arguments for why, when the economy was growing slowly, it made sense to keep interest rates that low. Because I don't feel like I'm qualified to make a judgment on, I couldn't tell you right now whether I think interest rates are too low. I'm able to weigh the arguments on both sides, but I'm not a macroeconomist with the years of training that you need, and so it's real tough for me to come to a conclusion. In terms of what we put in the dissent, I have a tough time concluding that U.S. monetary policy not only caused what happened in the U.S., but that was a major cause of credit bubbles that were occurring in a lot of European economies. Now, John has an argument for that. I have a tougher time with that part of his argument. And so even if you believe that U.S. monetary policy was a contributing factor, and I end up in the position it might have been, right? By itself, it can't explain the global credit bubble, at least in my view. And so you have to start with, what do you think caused the global credit bubble? And then do you think monetary policy also contributed to it, maybe in the U.S. and other places? Who's next? You know the rules. Name?
Robert Burns. I'm a freshman, and I live in Sarah.
Okay.
So earlier mentioned the excessive spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and that is really what we need to be focusing on. And so what are your opinions as how we can attack that issue?
I think the fundamental issue, when you pull out all of the policy details, I think the fundamental underlying issue is that elected officials have made promises that we don't have the money to fulfill. Right? And you can understand why members of Congress would do this. Right? It's nice to make promises. I promise that the government will give you this and this and this and all these different things, and especially the way these programs are structured, and the bill will come due later, maybe even later after I'm out of office. Right? We see this at the state level actually right now as state governments are struggling with politicians' promises to some of their public employee union workers, where they've made promises that they can't fully fund as well. So given that past politicians have made promises that we can't fund in the future, right, there are basically two ways to deal with it. One is, we're going to raise your taxes, right, like you wouldn't believe, starting in the next few years and forever through the remainder of your lives and your kids' lives and everybody else's lives as well, which is, we'll just permanently agree to have higher levels of taxes. And the problem is that the way the lines are shaped, taxes are like this and spending's like this, even if you do that, even if you raise taxes, that doesn't solve the problem forever. So if you have a solution which just raises taxes, I guarantee you that 20 years from now, you'll be back in this room asking the same question. Someone will be saying, well, we can buy ourselves another 20 years if we just raise taxes. You'll be saying, this really sounds familiar. The other way to do it is to change the promises that we make to young people. I'm going to include myself as a young person. I know you guys probably see me as old. But you don't try to change the promises for your grandparents who are already receiving these benefits, because frankly, they can't adjust. Right? It's not like your grandma and grandpa can go out and get a new job right now and pay for, the higher costs they have to. But I'm 42 years old. I got a long time before I even, am starting to think about retirement. And so if you could say, Keith, you're going to have to work an extra few years before you get benefits, my reaction would be, well, I don't like that, but okay, if that's what we have to do. Or if you said, Keith, we're going to change these programs so they're not forced savings programs for you, but we're going to change them into a safety net program, So that the promise that the government will make to you is, we're not promising you that the government will give you a check. We're not even promising you that the government will pay for your health benefits. What we're promising you is that when you're old, you won't be poor. All right? And so we're promising you that if you're poor, if you would otherwise be poor when you're old, the government will give you a check to make sure that you're not poor. Or if your health care costs would make you poor, then the government will cover those costs. So you could talk about changing the nature of the program from a program that pays everybody into a poverty protection program. Right? And then there are sort of solutions that are middle ground in between those things. But fundamentally, what it's about is saying, we're not going to try to make the promises to you guys and to me when we get to retirement age that we're making to today's senior citizens, because we're not going to have the money to pay for them. I actually think that that is doable because, for a couple reasons. One is, the younger you get, the less confidence you have in these programs. Right? Most of my friends are skeptical that these programs are going to be available and fully funded when they get there. When we get down to your age, you guys are like, yeah, Social Security's not going to be there. So it's not like we're asking you to give up a lot if we change those promises to you. And the other reason is a more blunt political reason, which is retirement is 40 or 45 or 50 years off for you guys, and it's the last thing that you're thinking about. Right? So if we say, I'm going to change the retirement promise that I'm making to y'all, your answer is, yeah, okay, whatever, I'm worried about graduation or maybe my student loans. And so in terms of the political impact, it's not as hard to get people to agree to it. Getting people in Washington to that point is pretty tough, but we're making progress slowly. Who's next? Behind you there.
Hi, my name is Autumn Carter. I'm a senior, and freshman year I lived in Burbank in Stern. So if we just kind of think about the State of the Union address and the average viewer, how do you think President Obama performed when communicating kind of maybe ideas, concepts to them? Did he sell them? Does he get a bump out of it? And if he doesn't get a bump out of it, do you see long-term gains or drawbacks to, him setting his policy now?
Yeah, I'm a policy guy, and you're asking me sort of communications and sort of political interpretation questions. So I'm out of my depth here. So I'll give you a very limited answer that's my best shot. What I saw last night was Mike Gerson had a really good op-ed in today's Washington Post about this. I saw something which was bipartisan in tone, but was not a change in terms of the president's substantive approach to policy. So civility, of course, is the new word. It was, he was congratulating the speaker a couple times. You had date night at the State of the Union where people were sitting next to members of the other party. And he was definitely in a very constructive and bipartisan tone in the way that he was talking about things. The substantive message that he was delivering, while it was delivered in a much more cooperative fashion, is something between basically unchanged and almost entirely unchanged from the one that he delivered over the past couple years. So the president gave a speech, I think it was last June at Carnegie Mellon, an economic speech, which I'd encourage you to read, in which he was talking about his philosophy of the interaction between government and the economy. And he was talking about a perspective in which economic growth comes in large part from government actions and government supports. Right? This is the government creating jobs, the government creating economic growth. I and a lot of my friends would have a different approach, which is that it's the government's role to create the conditions for economic growth, but the growth itself comes from individual actors and businesses and farmers and everybody else doing those things. The policies that he was talking about last night, while he was talking about them in a much more cooperative fashion, were look at all the things that we can do. And the key is, go back and look at the speech, and when you see the word we, try to interpret whether he means we the country or we the government. In a lot of cases, when he was saying we, if you rewrite that sentence with the word the government should, we should do X, and it means the government should spend more on highways, spend more on education, spend more on science and innovation. That's what falls in. My overly simplistic read of what happened last November is that you were having an instinctive pushback from the American people to an expansion of the role of government in society. People were saying, government's just trying to do too much, which I describe as the TARP, bailout, deficits, cap and trade, Obamacare, I'm sure I'm leaving a couple things out. But all of these big things that government was trying to do, and I think that a lot of the reason why Democrats lost so badly in the election is that people, even if they weren't familiar with all the details, they were just saying, you're trying to do too much. Stop trying to use government to solve problems in society. There are plenty of problems in society that are caused by too much government, so please let's move in the other direction. I heard him making the substantive case very politely and much more cooperatively than he did last fall, but it was a case for bigger government. And I think that that is fundamentally inconsistent with the message that I interpreted from the November election.
So do you think that message of the big government actually came through if people weren't listening as closely as you were?
I always have a tough time interpreting that. I think that it will certainly become apparent over the next few months as the debates play out. I know that the initial press coverage, almost everybody is telling some version. They're describing it as, look, it was a big government speech. You guys, probably a lot of you are too young to remember President Clinton famously said the era of big government is over. And that was a very significant statement for a Democratic president to say. What I was chuckling to myself last night is saying, well, the era of big government is back. That's at least the message I was hearing. And I think I give the American people a lot of credit for being able to sort of sort through all the filters and figure things out. I think they did with Obamacare when they were pushing back really aggressively.
My name's Tommy Schultz. I'm a senior, and I lived in Brainerd my freshman year. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I just wanted to find out what's next on the horizon for you. Any presidential campaigns or new projects that are coming up?
I am very happy here. I am teaching. I love teaching. So I taught a class last spring at the business school. I taught one at the business school, one at the law school last fall. I'm teaching one at the business school now. I'm teaching another one in the spring. So I imagine I'll be here for a while teaching, and I'm doing stuff at Hoover, working on the Hoover blog, Advancing a Free Society, which I hope you all are looking at, which basically collects the work of lots of smart people at Hoover where they're expressing their thoughts about what's going on in current policy discussions today. So at least for the near-term future, I imagine that I'll continue to do that because this is a great place to be and I get to teach and write and do things like that. I am not affiliated with any presidential campaign. I do spend a lot of time when I can find it writing for my blog and trying to just explain economic policy to whoever is foolish enough to want to read my stuff. So I'll continue to do that, keithhennessey.com. Should we do one more? Or?
Yeah,
One more.
We actually have one, an online question.
An online question,
From
cool.
Facebook, from Nathan Aldrich. And the question is, if you could boil down the three factors at the root of America's economic prosperity for the past 100 years, what would they be? And conversely, what factors are at the root of China's economic growth over the past several decades, and how are these factors different in the context of long-term prosperity and stability for each nation? So that's
Why did I take one more question? Okay, Nathan. Wow.
It's like a final essay.
Yeah. Holy mackerel. It's tough to limit it to just three for the U.S. I'll try. One is that we have a stable, relative to some other economies, we have a very stable and relatively small government, right? We have a generally solid system of laws and rules that make it efficient for people to have contracts. You don't have to worry about someone coming in and breaking a deal with you. You know that if you make a deal, that deal is going to be enforced. That element of contracts and contract law and having a stable legal framework is essential. And we have generally had, John Taylor might disagree, but we've generally had a monetary policy that, especially relative to some countries, hyperinflation has not been a problem. Inflation has not really been a problem since the early 80s. And so those are sort of some baseline elements there that everybody takes for granted. But if you're in some smaller economies, you can't take them for granted, and that's a real problem. I would say that I think our educational system, and in particular the interaction of higher education with technology development and innovation, is critical. Basically, the smartest kids in the world want to come to the U.S., to places like Stanford. I wish that we had a system which encouraged the smartest kids in the world to come to the U.S. and come to places like Stanford, and then we'd ask them to stay and found more Googles and Yahoos. Instead, we send a lot of them back home, which I think is a big mistake. I want the smartest people in the world to become Americans. But I think that incredible collegiate education system we have and the research that arises from it, and then places like Silicon Valley, where you get that interaction, that innovation, I think is absolutely critical in terms of long-run productivity growth, which is key. And then I think the other thing is an entrepreneurial culture, which I think is critical. Which is in the U.S., if you tell somebody that you're starting a small business, the almost instantaneous reaction is, that's fantastic, tell me about it. We reward people culturally for getting out there and taking risks, whether it's starting a small business or going to a startup or doing something risky. And our culture is one where we generally are not, most of us are not sort of huddled saying, I need to protect what I have. We tend to be risk-seeking and entrepreneurial, and I think that helps. I think it's a real advantage that we have over some other parts of the world. And I'm going to punt on the China part of the question. I mean, China is big. That's sort of the defining feature. It's big and it's been relatively poor. And so as it starts to grow rapidly, when it's starting from a small base, but when you have as many people as they do, as they grow, they just start to become a huge force in the economy. And they can grow and they can do things, and because they have less protections for individual rights, they can say, you know what, we're going to build a dam here, and we're going to relocate this entire village. In fact, I think President Obama talked about this last night. And we have private property protections and all sorts of individual freedoms and liberties that don't allow us to do that. There are some people who are looking admiringly at China and saying, look at the things that they can do. Look at these massive changes that they can make as they can, so for instance, I don't know if anyone's followed the high-speed rail discussion in California, right? There are some people who say we need to have a high-speed rail on the West Coast, and as you go to every single community, people are saying, I don't want the high-speed train here. Well, there are some people who argue that the Chinese have it set up better because they can just ignore the will of local communities and say we're putting the high-speed rail through. But I'm not sure that in the long run it's a good thing for, even if you set aside sort of the individual liberties question, are you going to be better off if you have government officials making lots of investment decisions? Right, saying we need a high-speed rail here, but not here, and we're gonna encourage companies here, and what market-based economics says is that government officials are going to get that wrong quite often, and that as messy as a system of lots of multiple actors interacting individually and making their decisions is, in the long run, it's going to be more efficient and more productive than government-directed investment. So that's why I ultimately have faith in the capitalist system and keep pushing back on attempts to further restrict it that we see from Washington. Good way to end. So, well, thank you for having me here. Really appreciate it.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.